Hi folks. We last left off in our story of the American literary canon with your Native American creation myths. And these start out, existed before there's even European arrival. Now we're going to pick that story back up, but there's some space to fill so that you can have a complete story of sort of what's happening in the literary tradition. So after arrival, we have the colonial period. This is the period of colonies. And this is dominated by really two types of literature, one of which is narratives of discovery. So these are histories, journals, records that are just sort of documenting what's going on in the New World. You know, what the landscape looks like, what the native peoples look, act, behave like, what's going on with the settlements, those sorts of things. You also have a lot of narratives of religious expression. The colonial period, one of the dominant groups, at least as it applies to literature, were the Puritans, because they valued literacy so highly, and religion was the most important thing in their lives. So we do see a lot of literature about religious expression during the colonial period. Following that, we have the Revolutionary period, which is when we are fighting to become a nation, establish a constitution and a democracy and all of that. And this is dominated by what's called the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment. So during this period of time, the social thought highly values science, reason, logic, philosophy, rhetoric. They're highly valuing these sort of logical qualities, the sort of rational, objective truth of the world. And this is the philosophy that gets us through the revolution. This is where we get Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which is often credited with sparking the revolution. Hamilton's The Federalist Papers, the writings of Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, and these are all very Enlightenment influenced text, because they are about politics, objectivity, knowledge, logic, those sorts of things. Now, this brings us to the early 19th century, which is the early 1800s. This is after we have won the war, we have established that we are a nation, and now the question of now what happens. Well, now what? Now we're a country. Now, what are we going to do? What are we going to do now? And this is where we get the first established literary traditions in the American canon. So during this period, we have the Romantic era, and the Romantic era actually spans most of the 19th century, and it includes multiple traditions that we're going to cover over the next several story sets. But generally speaking, the Romantic tradition is a direct move away from the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment. So rather than valuing science, logic, knowledge, rhetoric, rather than valuing those sorts of things, the Romantic period values emotion, intuition, expression, creativity, and of course this is very convenient for literature because it's a little bit more artistic, but we see that sort of shift in the literature here as well. So I think a good way to think about what the American Romantic tradition is by comparing it to the British Romantic tradition. So the British Romantic tradition is the tradition of knights going off on adventures to save damsels, to fight bad guys, to save kingdoms. That's the British Romantic tradition. And our Romantic tradition is that, but make it America. So what do we have that corresponds to that? Well, we were a brand new country. We were still sort of figuring that out. But one of the things that relates to this sort of heroic adventure is the frontier myth. Now, generally speaking, Romantic American literature is defined by a number of things, but generally speaking, it includes nature. Nature plays an important role. It emphasizes the individual, or self-reliance, the sort of rugged individual, make it on their own. It emphasizes emotion, typically the emotions of, the characters, rather than the sort of logic and objective truth of the situation. Now we care about the emotions, feelings, and experiences of characters. And it also emphasizes this sort of idea of adventure, which can be interpreted in a number of different ways. But now there are a lot of as I mentioned, subgenres and traditions beneath the umbrella of the Romantic era, which we'll get into. But we start with the Romantic era by reading James Fenimore Cooper's From the Last of the Mohicans and reading from Catherine Mariah Cedric's Hope Leslie. And these two stories, or these two excerpts that you'll be reading, relate to Romanticism through another cultural myth specific to the American identity, and that is what's known as the frontier myth. So to get into the frontier myth, I want to ask you this to start off with. What comes to your head when I say the frontier, the American frontier? What do you picture? What shows up in your head? Probably something like this, right? This sort of wild wilderness that, cowboys or outlaws go out and conquer and have adventures in, or, something of this aesthetic. What comes into your head when I say the American West, out west? Probably something similar, right? So the idea of the frontier myth, again, myths are central to a culture, and the frontier becomes central to American culture during this period as well, for a number of different reasons. But first of all, what even is a frontier? Well, a frontier is just a border, and the American frontier is the border between civilization and the wild, or civilization and savagery. And if you think about it, this is one of the things that is, the nation was trying to figure out their identity. They sort of felt very attached to, because since our arrival, we've been sort of pushing against the unknown, pushing against the wild, sort of making our way out into this, untamed land, if you will. And that's a frontier. And by this time, people are heading out west, and the frontier is, in the eyes of many people, it's sort of gone, it's disappeared, the frontier's been conquered. And so the romanticism element here is that it sort of romanticizes this idea of something in a, almost in a nostalgic way, but it also deals with a mythology that is foundational to culture. So, what do we mean when we say the frontier myth? Now, the American frontier existed. What makes it mythical? Well, we really have there are two wests, or two frontiers in literature and in, social imagination. You have the actual historical frontier, which was, farmers, ranchers, some outlaws and hoodlums, getting up to shenanigans, but largely speaking, it was just sort of an agricultural and very difficult, place, which is not the same place as the idealized, imagined version of the frontier, which is where outlaws and cowboys go off to, conquer the wild and make it on their own, and, they're rugged individuals that are, experience growth and self-actualization in nature and the wild. That's what we mean by the frontier myth. And the frontier myth is actually the genesis for American Westerns, and Westerns are a uniquely American subgenre. But the frontier myth is something that people would hold in very high value throughout this period. And one of the sort of earliest authors to engage with this is James Fenimore Cooper. Now, the frontier myth involves a number of archetypes, and one of those archetypes is the hero. Now, remember, in the British romantic tradition, the hero is the knight who is going off to save the damsel. In the American romantic tradition and in the frontier myth, you have the frontier hero. So this is typically either an outlaw or a cowboy or a trapper sometimes, who is on the fringes of society, right? He doesn't fit in with, he's sort of on the edge of the social acceptability. He makes it on his own out in the wild. He's rugged. He relies on himself. He's often faced with natural challenges, bears, the natural world, Native Americans, things out there in nature that sort of prove his worth or heroism. He's often moral, but questionably so, right? So he does the right thing, but he, in a sort of edgy way, I guess. He's sort of morally gray, if you will. Even though he often does do the right thing, he's still a little bit violent, a little bit coarse, a little bit rough around the edges. So Daniel Boone is the first sort of established frontier hero, or Davy Crockett would be a frontier hero. In James Fenimore Cooper, we have Natty Bumppo, or Hawkeye, and he is a quintessential frontier hero. He's this, sort of broody, doesn't fit in with society, out there in the wilderness, making it on his own, having adventures, saving damsels, that sort of thing. And you'll read about that in The Last of the Mohicans. Now, what makes this part of the Romantic tradition is that what you'll see is that this story focuses on the hero's experience, emotion, knowledge, intuition. We're focused on sort of Hawkeye's feelings, which was new after the Enlightenment and Age of Reason. Other archetypes that you see in the frontier myth involve Native Americans and women. So Native Americans are typically represented in one of two ways. You have the savage, and that it's this sort of caricaturized version of a violent, immoral, feral Native American who is just basically out to, murder, rape, steal from white Americans. Then you have the noble savage. An example of the noble savage is Chingachgook in The Last of the Mohicans. So you'll see what that looks like. But the noble savage is typically a friend of the white American. They are, a sort of connection between the native groups and the civilization. So they're, again, engaging with that idea of the border between the two of them. They're oftentimes a little bit mystic, or almost sort of like a nature whisperer. And again, these are based in cultural stereotypes, and they're problematic, but they are features of the frontier myth that you'll see in both of these texts. And then we have archetypes of women. So typically women are represented, again, one of two ways. You have the morally upright, pure woman who is worthy of saving. Typically that's what they're doing, is, getting saved from dangerous situations. And you'll see that in The Last of the Mohicans, or The Last of the Mohicans utilizes that. So in the story, essentially, you have two daughters of a colonel, Cora and Alice Monroe, who are being transported to another fort by our hero Natty Bumppo. And these are your a classic example of these sort of women who are worthy of protection and need to be saved because they are good and upright and moral, and also a little bit squeamish about violence. They're always, there's a lot of no, don't no, don't go on that adventure that you see in the frontier myth. And then the other archetype that you'll see of women in frontier mythology is the complete opposite, the temptress, the one that's trying to corrupt the hero, or trying to, oftentimes is, sexualized in a very overt way. And oftentimes these are racially coded. Literature is tied to culture, and that means it's also tied to cultural problems. So oftentimes these are represented in Native women or Mexican women. But these are the sort of archetypes and ideas that you'll see in the frontier myth. And this feeds into the American Western. And in a lot of different iterations still exists, the idea of a frontier, of a rugged individual conquering the unknown, is still a very important part of our cultural identity today. So I look forward to your thoughts on these stories. I've already given you some context for The Last of the Mohicans, but for context on Hope Leslie, you are reading a chapter in which Magawiska discusses the Pequot War, which was an actual event that took place. Both of these are considered historical romances. And essentially this was just a conflict between the Pequot tribe and Massachusetts colonies. But specifically it's referring to the Mystic Massacre, which is where the colonists surrounded this tribe of Pequot and trapped them and then set it on fire. And pretty much all of the tribe members died. Those who escaped were killed by soldiers surrounding them. So it was, a horrible tragedy for the Pequots, but it was held up as this sort of, valiant, conquering thing by the Massachusetts colonists who had done it. If you're interested in that, I'll include some resources in your supplemental folder, but that's what that story is dealing with. So as you're reading these stories, keep an eye out for the frontier myth, the frontier archetypes, this idea of emotion, and romanticism, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on them.